Hello and welcome to this post-game review of the International Kriegsspiel Society's Italian campaign of 1796. The campaign was played over 4 sessions between January 2023 and April 2024. Chief and James were the primary umpires in each game. Before each game began, players were allocated troops and given initial options resembling historical deployments. The results of each game influenced the starting point of the next. Each player commanded one division, denoted by the flags. Logistics and supply were simulated, so players were encouraged to disperse their forces across different towns in order to avoid overburdening their supplies. By 1796, the strategic situation in Italy was precarious for the French. Even though France had, by the end of 1795, fought the coalition off French soil, they were still faced with powerful coalition armies. The coalition forces in northern Italy were comprised of Austrians, Piedmontese, and Neapolitans, supported by the British Royal Navy, who together were poised to cross the mountain passes into southern France. However, the French, under the tactical control of Andrea Massena, had preempted their invasion. Massena's attack drove the Austro-Piedmontese army back from the French frontier and captured the mountain passes into Piedmont. On the 2nd of March, 1795, Bonaparte was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Italy. Revitalizing the neglected and poorly supplied force, his 37,000 men were still faced with more than 50,000 coalition forces in the theatre. The Piedmontese fielded some 20,000 men, and the Austrians some 30,000. The Austrian and Piedmontese players were unable to coordinate their starting deployments in the first game. As a result, the Piedmontese forces were deployed far forward, close to the French, whereas the Austrians chose a more conservative and dispersed position, with the majority of their forces deployed north near Alessandria. The game began on the 3rd of April, with Napoleon ordering 2 divisions east to Genoa as a distraction. The rest of his forces moved north, intending to quickly destroy the Piedmontese army before the Austrians could move to support them. The Piedmontese had sent 1 division further south to Nice in order to cut off the French line of supply. The Austrians had begun their march westwards towards Asti, with 3 divisions, hoping that the Piedmontese were deployed further north so that they would be able to combine their forces before jointly facing the French. The Austrian commander, Giulio, was, however, unaware of the Piedmontese position and only realized how far south they were deployed when it was too late. On the 10th of April, the French won their first victory at Alzare. Napoleon and Garnier's combined divisions defeated the Piedmontese and Austrian divisions under Briempt and Micharoch. Napoleon managed to capture roughly half of Briempt's division. Napoleon's northwest advance had him running into Colli and the main Piedmontese army. On the 12th of April, Colli decides to give battle at Ceva, where he and the rest of his army is overrun and captured. The Piedmontese army was thus defeated in 6 days. Colli was forced to capitulate and sign an armistice, allowing the French army to march freely through Piedmont. Napoleon's rapid advance had by now tired his army, and he had outrun his supplies. But in return, he had been rewarded with 2 major victories and 1 of his opponents defeated. With Sardinia-Piedmont out of the war, Napoleon could turn his sights towards Beaulieu and the Austrians. After the battle, Napoleon sent Garnier's division northeast to watch for the Austrian arrival, while allowing the rest of his army to take 1 day's rest. Garnier found the Austrian vanguard under Schröder, marching south near Dago, but after a short battle, the Austrians were forced back. On the 16th of April, 2 simultaneous battles were fought. The first near Voltri, where Kisfelud's division ran into Pigeon, heading west, and at Cairo, where 2 Austrian divisions stumbled into 5 French divisions. The Austrians lose both battles, and the French managed to capture the Austrian commander, Beaulieu. On the 17th of April, Argenteau's Austrian division ran into Pigeon at Cogoretto, The steep terrain, covered in vegetation, made the fighting difficult, and both sides were reinforced later in the day. Stengel's French cavalry and Schröder's Austrian infantry divisions arrived from the north. The fighting resulted in a stalemate, but the Austrians decided to retreat east on their lines of communication in order to regroup with their reinforcements. The second game fast-forwarded to the 30th of May. Napoleon captured Milan and had time to rest and refit his army while receiving some reinforcements. The French then chased the Austrians to the Mincio River. Here, in a solid defensive position, the Austrians intended to hold while awaiting further reinforcements from 5 fresh divisions under the command of Wurmser, who was arriving from the north. Napoleon's southernmost division, under Marcard, moved east across the Mincio to invest the fortress of Mantua. French cavalry under Stengel rushed north to slow the Austrian reinforcements coming from Botzen. The Austrians, anticipating a French crossing, had destroyed several bridges over the Mincio. In response, Napoleon had ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge south of Peschiera, intending to lay siege to the fortress from its eastern side. However, the construction was delayed due to Austrians floating barrels downstream, and as the first pontoon bridge was completed, the Austrians decided to attack it in order to prevent the French from crossing. Ultimately, the Austrians were unsuccessful and retreated to the relative safety of the walls of Peschiera. The French, under Marcard, began besieging the Austrians in Mantua, but Austrian cavalry, under Messatros, moved to relieve Mantua. After a day's battle, the Austrians, however, were unable to relieve the city and retreated north. Marcard's division then found itself caught between Kishfelug to the north and Metzerosch to the south. At the same time, Stengel's cavalry ran into Kostanovich's infantry division near Rovedero. He had, however, just missed the Austrian cavalry reinforcements under Melas, who remained unopposed in the south. While Kostanovich's force ultimately was stronger than Stengel, he was significantly slower due to his lack of cavalry. On the 3rd of June, there were 3 separate battles. The first, at Rovedero, where Pijon joined Stengel in order to hold back Kostanovich, who was waiting for the arrival of Davidovich's division. The second, at Peschiera, where the Austrians attempted to break out, but after heavy fighting, they were contained by the French. The third, at Verbella, where Marcard and Argenteau's divisions were captured by Mezerados and Kisfelou. In the north, Kostanovich was joined by Davidovich. Together, the two had enough strength to force John and Stengel back. The French were at risk of being trapped in the Adige Valley, as Melas had moved north to cut off their escape. In the south, Darnett was faced with 3 Austrian divisions, and was forced to withdraw after giving battle at Montanaro. As Napoleon received news about the capture of Argenteau and Marcard, he ordered a general withdrawal back to Milan, where he intended to rest and await further reinforcement. The second game ended with the Austrian forces having succeeded in relieving Mantua and inflicting several defeats on the French forces. Game 3 started on the 1st of August. Napoleon's army received some reinforcements at Milan and some much-needed rest. The Austrians had likewise been reinforced. Both sides now matched each other in strength. The Austrians were allowed to deploy anywhere east of the river Chitze. French could deploy anywhere west of the river Arda. The Austrians opted to remain concentrated near Peschiera, with small forces watching their flanks near Mantua and Bagaglia in the south. The French chose to divide their troops along 4 separate routes, intending to converge on Peschiera. By dispersing themselves, the French were able to move more swiftly compared to the Austrians, but it required greater coordination. If any of the French columns were attacked, they would risk being defeated in detail. Nearly the entire Austrian army opted to travel down a single road. This simplified command, but as they advanced, they would be strung out along nearly 30 miles of road as they marched. By the evening of the first day, scouts from both armies ran into each other near Cocaglio. It had until then been unclear for both commanders where the other would concentrate for battle. On August 2nd at mid-afternoon, both armies converged at Peschiera. This would develop into the Battle of Ospitaletto. Alvinci, commanding the vanguard of the Austrian column, had begun skirmishing with Messina in the early morning. Kostanovic, having to move with the long Austrian column, arrived on Alvinci's left by about 3:30 in the afternoon. Davidovich similarly had orders to march to Kostanovic's aid, but he was slowed by the presence of Stengel's cavalry in the south. Davidovich had deployed his division to deal with the French horsemen, but the delay created a gap between his division and Kostanovic. At the same time, Kilmain's division was beginning to arrive from the south. Sensing the opportunity, Stengel decided to exploit the gap and drive a wedge between Davidovich and Kostanovic's divisions. Kilmain swung west, aiming for Kostanovic's rear. At the same time, the fight between Messina and Alvinci had escalated, as both tried to outflank the other by moving to the north. Davidovich was, by 4:30, still unable to join the main engagement developing in the west due to French cavalry slowing his progress. As fighting erupted along Messina's front, the weight of the Austrian numbers made his position precarious. However, Kilmain's quick advance in the rear of the Austrian position forced the Austrians to deploy their reserve east, while the attack from the western flank was underway. At the same time, Davidovich was being slowed by French cavalry setting fires to the fields in front of him. Assailed from all sides, the Austrian position had become desperate by about 5 o'clock. Alvinci and Kostanovic had both become surrounded, and Davidovich was still marching to the battlefield. The Austrians tried to stage a breakout, attacking the French lines in the east to link up with Davidovich, but Stengel's forces checked them. Further east, Davidovich was again slowed by French cavalry. By dusk, the bulk of the Austrian army had been forced to surrender, and Alvinci was amongst the captured. Kostanovic narrowly escaped in the south with a few regiments. Davidovich, arriving, but by then too late to rescue the Austrian army, was ordered to retreat. With nearly half the Austrian army captured, Napoleon and the Army of Italy managed to gain a significant victory. Game 4 started 3 days later on the 5th of August. The remnants of the Austrian army had retreated to Peschiera and the familiar safety of the Mincio River. On arrival, additional forces were dispatched to hold Mantua. As the French pursuit began, they were aware that the Austrians would soon be significantly reinforced, under the command of Archduke Charles, while the French also would have reinforcements on the way. Theirs were further off. When both sets of reinforcements had arrived, the armies would, again, be nearly equal in strength. However, the Austrians had a brief window with which they would have a significant numerical superiority over the French. Napoleon once again ordered his divisions to move along separate paths to assess the Austrian position. Kilmain had already crossed the Mincio River and occupied Valeggio. He began constructing defences as Austrian reinforcement arrived on the east. On the 8th of August, the Austrians won 2 smaller engagements. In the north, Stengel had ordered a cavalry brigade under Fiorella to reconnoitre east Peschiera. As they advanced, they were surprised by Provera's cavalry near Cavalcaselle and were captured before they could escape west across the Mincio. Simultaneously, at Valeggio, Archduke Charles led a powerful assault against Kilmain's division. With overwhelming numbers, the Austrians defeated Kilmain, forcing his troops to retreat back across the Mincio. Despite these setbacks, the French reinforcements were beginning to arrive near Peschiera. On the 9th of August, still reeling from 2 defeats, the French decided to retreat northwest as Austrians gave a cautious pursuit. On the 10th of August, the Austrians concentrated their forces and attacked near Desenzano. However, the French, bolstered by newly arrived reinforcements, were able to hold their ground and inflict heavy casualties on the Austrians. Emboldened by his newly arrived reinforcements and his victory at Desenzano, Napoleon went on the offensive. The Austrians again quickly retreated east of the Mincio. The Davidovich division was stretched along the road between Castiglione and Goito. Late on the 11th of August, the French managed to cut off a portion of Davidovich's division, but failed to coordinate effectively. the Austrians fought themselves clear and successfully regrouped southeast of Goito. The following day, Wurmser, having been tasked with defending Peschiera, believed that the French forces monitoring the city were relatively weak and decided to leave the defences and attack them, despite orders from Archduke Charles to the contrary. The initial fight swung in favour of the Austrians as the French forces under Buchon retreated. Wurmser launched pursuit, hoping to achieve a significant victory and capture a division. However, he was unaware of the 3 additional French divisions to his south. The French quickly seized on the opportunity and swung north, cutting him off from Peschiera. Wurmser became pinned against Lake Garda. With no other option, he surrendered his forces, which amounted to roughly a quarter of the Austrian forces in Italy. This dispelled any belief in a renewed Austrian offensive. Their only hope now was to hold on to the defensive positions along the Mincher. The Wurmser captured army sent west to Bricha. The French forces could once again move and probe the Austrian defences along the Mincher River. However, in a daring move, Davidovich launched a cavalry raid that successfully destroyed a poorly defended French supply depot at Castiglione. This audacious strike put the French supply lines at serious risk. The destruction of the depot meant that the army of Italy would soon be without essential supplies. This left the French with only 2 options: either achieve a swift, decisive victory, or retreat and wait for more supplies to arrive. Meanwhile, Archduke Charles enacted a bold plan. He decided to retreat from the Mincher, luring the French across the river. Then he would launch a counterattack while the French forces were caught partially crossed. This strategy aimed to exploit the French vulnerability during the river crossing, thereby turning the tide in favour of the Austrians. The plan initially worked as intended. The Austrians managed to catch the French army mid-crossing, leaving them highly vulnerable. However, a critical communication error led to a significant flaw. Archduke Charles's main force ended up miles away from Prevera's contingent. This miscommunication created a gap in the Austrian lines, which would prove disastrous. The Battle of Alleggio commenced in the early afternoon of the 15th of August. In the north, Pijon's division watched Peschiera to ensure that the Austrian forces holding the city would not sally out and threaten the French rear. Kustanovich left a few regiments there and took the rest of his forces south to join Archduke Charles to develop the main battle against Massena, who had already crossed the Mincher near Montezambino. Massena, facing a significant numerical disadvantage, was at risk of being trapped by the river. Despite Napoleon's overwhelming forces in the south, most of his forces were still on the western side of the river. The Austrian plan was at this time working as intended. However, their attacks were poorly coordinated. Their inability to coordinate and communicate bought time for the French to cross the Mincher with strength. By 3 p.m, Kustanovich had launched his main attack against Massena's position. Archduke Charles had decided to take direct command of the Austrian cavalry. This consisted of a significant contingent of fresh, heavy cavalry. He identified 2 options: either attack Massena's southern flank to coordinate with Kustanovich, or confront the arriving French cavalry under Stengel. He chose to attack Stengel, northeast of Alleggio. While the attack was initially successful, the routed French cavalry managed to escape and regroup behind their arriving reinforcements. Further south, Prevera was distracted and slowed by a small cavalry force under Stengel. Meanwhile, Kilmaine and Davidovich maneuvered around each other, jockeying for position. Had Prevera and Davidovich coordinated their efforts, they would have been able to destroy Kilmaine's force before the arriving French reinforcements. The Salle and Bernadotte had mostly crossed the river and were now racing north to Valleggio to reinforce Stengel and Massena. This timely reinforcements tipped the balance in favour of the French. By 5 p.m, Kustanovich's division was exhausted and had halted its attack. This allowed Massena to retreat back across the Mincher. Meanwhile, Prevera was engaged in a battle facing La Salle, Stengel and Bernadotte outside Valleggio. Davidovich and Kilmaine continued their manoeuvring, with Kilmain's cavalry suffering a rout in a minor skirmish. The window for the Austrians to leverage their numerical advantage against the French was closed. The French forces were now entirely across the Mincio and in full strength. Archduke Charles then decided to launch one more attack from the north to support Provera, but the attack was easily repulsed. Provera's lines began to get overrun, and Davidovich and Kilmain deployed to face off. With the arrival of Lahr, the French had gained the advantage, and they decided to press it. At the onset of dusk, the Austrian forces had been soundly beat. Charles's gambit had not paid off. Provera had been captured along with most of his division. Davidovich had been overrun. Charles and Kostanovich had been able to withdraw northeast in relative good order, but it was a clear French victory. As a result, the Austrians were forced to abandon northern Italy in its entirety to the French, much as they did historically. The game thereby ended with a historical result. Special thanks to everyone who participated in the game and watched this post-game report.